The US is suffering a 32-day government shutdown where people aren't being paid and business is on standby, all because President Donald Trump wants a wall to prevent migrants entering the US from Mexico. But this hasn't stopped caravans of migrants and refugees making their way in. The latest is a group of Central Americans traveling overland through Mexico to the northern border with the US.
The group of about 1,000 migrants stops to rest in a park ahead of the next leg of their journey. It hasn't been easy in the sweltering heat. Unlike previous caravans, this group hasn't received food aid from Mexico. They blame the migrant caravan before them for creating ill will among locals and authorities.
There are security concerns in the group. There have been threats and things we have suffered through. Threats against other caravans that things will be done to them. God willing, we reach our final destination.
Trump has described the migrants as an invading force and sent troops to the border. But these are families, mothers and children trying to escape poverty and violence back home. Undaunted by the hardships and Trump's threats, they press on in search of a better life.
The United States is not the only country facing a tide of migrants from war-torn and poverty-stricken countries. Migration from the Middle East and North Africa has fueled calls against the so-called Islamization of Europe. Xenophobia is also spreading in South Africa. Many locals here blame migrants for taking away jobs and indulging in crime. Now, even the ruling ANC is turning. The party's recent election manifesto calls for tougher measures against illegal migrants. It also wants incentives for migrants to remain in their own countries. Now, most of these refugees leave because of the horrors at home. I mean, imagine putting your child on a boat which they might never get off alive. How desperate must you be? And that is a better scenario than staying at home. I mean, doesn't anyone care at the World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland? Our guest tonight is in Davos, Kumi Naidoo, Secretary General of Amnesty International. Kumi Naidoo, does anyone care there, do you think, about this humanitarian crisis we're seeing?
There has been very limited focus on the refugee crisis. The head of UN High Commissioner for Refugees was here. I just had a one-to-one meeting with him. We're trying to push the refugee agenda, but sadly, there's a lot of lies being told. Like, for example, there isn't a migrant crisis in the United States. If you look at the 80s, 90s, the 2000s and so on, you were having 1 million people coming every year into the United States. That number has dropped down. President Donald Trump has used this and has weaponized the issue of migration. And Jane, you're absolutely right. We have to start with the question of how desperate are the conditions. Well, nobody wants to migrate from their home, right? No. Any one of us who has been exiled, you want to stay in your home if you can. People are acting out of desperation, and it is sad to see some of the richest countries in the world behaving with such a pathetic attitude when, in fact, Africa and Asia actually have absorbed, African countries like Kenya or South Sudan and so on, have absorbed more refugees than the US, a rich country, or for that matter, Bangladesh and the 1 million Rohingya refugees.
Yeah, but look what's happening in Zimbabwe and Sudan, and that's only going to add to this problem, isn't it? And nobody wants to take them in because of this rising xenophobia.
Absolutely. And xenophobia is like one of the cheapest tricks in the book that politicians can use to get elected and to win favor. I am disappointed to hear that the ANC has got this in the manifesto.
Correct.
I would say to the leadership of the ANC that we must not forget our history. We must not forget the extraordinary solidarity that African countries offered us when we were in exile. And it is a really bad way to repay that solidarity that was critical for the success of our liberation struggle by having a manifesto that actually includes a blanket sort of line which actually could potentially breed xenophobia.
I mean, it's an easy target, as you say, and they are easy victims to bash for your own end. What can be done about it to stop it, other than dealing with the root causes?
Okay, so Amnesty International is making this one of its key global programs. It's a program called Be There. And what we are looking at is the entire refugee experience from the moment that they are making the decision to actually leave. And of course, we all should. I don't disagree with the ANC manifesto when it says we should be contributing to making it the conditions that people are facing livable, to eradicate repression and so on. Absolutely, we should do that. And that's something that we should do. But still we know, also because of another factor that's going to make this issue much more serious, and that is the question of people that will be migrating because of climate impact. There's a term now, it's not a legal term, in refugee law called climate refugees or climate migrants. So we know that it's going to be happening. So we have to prepare every step of the way, including, for when people land up in camps, to ensure young children get education and so on. So we have to change the narrative. And if you ask...
But let me just jump in here. I mean, how do you get people to care? I mean, do you think there's some sort of fatigue happening around the world? Their attention has been diverted elsewhere?
Well, I think, there was a sort of global survey done recently, which was released here at the World Economic Forum, which shows that globally, 70% plus or minus people in the world actually think support of refugees and even migration is a good thing. And if you ask economists in the US, in most European countries and so on, to actually quantify the impact that refugees actually have, most of the time, overwhelmingly so, it's net positive to the economy. So I think there's a lot of sort of lies that are told in the story, and we need to refute those lies as one part of our response. But also we have to develop a sort of human rights education type of initiative that gets people to understand that human solidarity in a situation like this is critically important, and we need to push our government to work. Now in December, in Marrakesh, there was the adoption at the United Nations Conference of a global compact on migration. Sadly, Donald Trump and the US didn't sign on, and Bolsonaro in Brazil, one of the first things he did after getting elected was to withdraw Brazil from it. But still, the majority of the countries are working towards it's not as strong a global migration pact as we'd like, but it is something that moves us substantially in a positive direction, and I think we should educate ourselves and work to make this pact come alive.
Kumi Naidi, there you are in Davos, pushing it on the agenda. Good luck to you, and thanks for talking to us. Here are some of tonight's news headlines. A vote to end the U.S. government shutdown is expected on Thursday. Senate leaders have agreed to vote on 2 bills. The spending bill includes funds for U.S. President Donald Trump's Mexican border wall and another for extending funding for closed agencies until next month. The U.S. shutdown has forced 800,000 federal employees to work without pay or take compulsory leave. Russia has for the first time officially confirmed its presence in Sudan. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs says private Russian companies are training the army. Demonstrations have been on the streets daily since December. Initially, the protest was against an economic crisis. This is in Venezuela. It later escalated to call for an end to the 30-year rule of President Omar Bashir. That's still in Sudan. Official statistics from the Russian Federal Security Service show that 200 Russians traveled to Sudan in the fourth quarter of 2017. Those pictures we're looking at, Venezuelans back on the streets too. They want to force President Nicolas Maduro to step down. The opposition party is hoping that this renewed push will help persuade the country's military to break ranks with the president. The battle lines have been drawn at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Some countries say we should be focusing on national self-interest rather than global rules. All the while, Zimbabwe's finance minister, Ntuli Ncube, is looking to other countries, including ours, for a bailout. eNCA's Annika Larsen is there and spoke to Ncube. Annika, what did he say?
Well, he didn't rule out any assistance from Russia, but he would not confirm or deny that South Africa has extended any sort of financial assistance. We spoke to the Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni, earlier, who said no money has been decided on yet, or whether any financial credit will be given to cut down that $4 billion loan that Zimbabwe owes. And it seems that they're doing a diplomatic dance at the moment, talking to each other. But I think that Mboweni, our Finance Minister, really wants to see proper change in Zimbabwe. He wants a more comprehensive sort of economic reform before he passes any money along their way.
Okay, I think we've got that soundbite, so let's listen to it, Annika.
The two countries are talking, and they are always talking, by the way. We know that we have excellent relations that go back decades. Most favored nation, status arrangements. Basically, that's what it is. We have a bilateral, binational commission between the two countries. We have a relationship between the central banks, and now we have a very strong relationship within the ministries of finance. So really, we are talking continuously to see how South Africa can be more supportive of where Zimbabwe wants to move in terms of its economic reform agenda, and we continue to talk. And so far, so good. You have seen the comments from President Ramaphosa, which has been very positive, and we thank him for that. The comments from the Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni. I just met with the President briefly, Ramaphosa, this afternoon. I had coffee with the Governor of Central Bank, Lesetja, Khanyago, and yesterday I met with Tito Mboweni. So we continue to enjoy these warm and supportive relations. I would say our relationship is excellent.
Has there been any promise for short-term credit to make sure that you can help write off your $4.7 billion loan?
Well, we continue to have a dialogue. We continue to have discussions. We're really at the beginning of those conversations, so to say. We'll see how things evolve, to see how South Africa could really become a partner in making sure that we can deal with our arrears clearance. And by the way, it's not just about South Africa extending resources or whatever. It's about South Africa also giving us the support we need internationally within the Bretton Woods institutions, within the Paris Club family of creditors to Zimbabwe. That support, that extra voice coming from Africa, from the region, from South Africa, is needed for us to successfully restructure our debt globally.
Are you having to deal with the reports that came out of Zimbabwe 2 weeks ago of a brutal crackdown, of a internet shutdown, altogether severe and quite serious domestic problems? How are you dealing with those here at the World Economic Forum?
Well, you know what? The President of Zimbabwe has been very clear as of yesterday when he arrived that, look, violence has no place in our political space, in our dialogue across the divide, and is calling for us to close that divide through peace, through unity, through dialogue. He's very clear about that. He said there's no place for violence, and in a sense he's leading from the front and is leading the government in that direction, a more peaceful environment and calm. And by the way, there is calm right now. You mentioned the issue of the internet. This was just a tactical instrument, a tactical maneuver to try to contain the situation. It was not it was temporary. It was not an issue of permanency. And look, after a couple of days or so, the internet is back and is back to business. It was just a simple way to try to contain the situation. And I think let's say that it kind of worked somewhat, or rather it contributed to stabilizing the situation.
A curious remark, I thought, that to shut down the internet was just a security measure to restore calm and order. I think I said later on in the interview that you cannot cut off your people. It was almost verging on a human rights abuse to not allow people to communicate with the rest of the world. And he seemed to think that there was a concerted campaign online to start some sort of protest or resurrection by Zimbabwean people, and that really cutting down all internet was the way forward in terms of managing the situation.
Seems to be increasingly popular. Thanks for that, Annika, live from Davos. Now let's get the latest on the performance of world markets today with my colleague Rofhiwa Madzena. What's been happening?
Thank you very much, Jane. So the European stocks are still in the red this week. Meanwhile, the pound is trading at its highest level since November. And some disappointing economic data out of the US. Investment analyst at 27/4 Investments, Nadir Thokan, joins me now to break it all down. Nadir, thank you very much for your time this evening. Let's perhaps start with those European shares. We saw the same kind of action on Monday, and we're seeing it again. And the theme here is that uncertainty around China's growth.
Yeah, no doubt about it. You know, China's growth numbers came out earlier this week. 6.4% growth for the calendar year 2018. Slowest growth rate since 1990. So China definitely slowing down. But it's a very deliberate slowdown. You know, I think the world is making a whole lot about not much here because the Chinese authorities are deliberately trying to slow down certain sectors of the economy which are overheating. They're trying to prevent over-indebtedness of the Chinese economy. We know that, you know, there's an excessive amount of debt within the Chinese economy, somewhere in the region of around $800 billion worth of debt. And we know that the shadow banking system has about 5% of bad loans on their books. And this is after they wrote down a considerable amount last year. So China is slowing down. Look, Europe is faced with its own sets of problems. You know, Europe is really battling to emerge into any kind of sustainable growth pretty much since the global financial crisis. And I think the fact that they're battling to get inflation going there, the fact that they're battling a number of political disjointedness issues where the collectiveness and the sanctity of the European Union is being severely called into question is obviously weighing on sentiment, it's weighing on consumption, it's weighing on investments. And we're seeing the result of that in terms of earnings growth and ultimately companies battling to find opportunities to invest within Europe. And, you know, we're seeing the impact of that on the stock exchange.
Right. And I mean, you anticipate this is going to last for a while, given those factors that you've just mentioned.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the amount of political instability that's out there is going to remain elevated for some time. And I suppose the one thing that can be said about Europe is that the shares are trading quite cheaply. But what we do know historically about Europe over the last 10 years is that we kind of start the year with a fairly decent number for earnings growth. This year it's at about 8 or 9% composite for Europe. And as the year goes on, we just see consistently downgrades to those earnings estimates. So, and I think the market is not pricing in much action out of Europe. You know, there could be a bit of a bump run if we see a lot of the political issues being sorted out, but difficult to see that happening. So I think there's more attractive opportunities elsewhere, which is not going to be weighed down by these sentiment issues.
Right, let's move over to the UK. We saw the pound trading at really decent levels, and these are levels we last saw in November. So are we safe to say that there is a confidence that there's going to be a less likely no-deal exit out of the EU for Britain?
Yeah, this has been a difficult one to call, right? I mean, who would have thought that the week during which Theresa May had her Brexit deal not only dismissed by Parliament, but thrown out wholesale by Parliament by an enormous margin, right? Who would have thought that the market reaction would have been what it is? I mean, it's been a complete non-reaction from the markets. Look, I mean, I think the way the market is thinking about this is, listen, that March 29 deadline is getting closer. And a deal is so far away. It doesn't seem like Europe is in the mood to be renegotiating any deal. And Parliament is certainly not going to be passing the deal in its current format. So perhaps the market is thinking a second referendum, maybe Brexit is not happening. Or if Brexit is happening, a referendum directly to the people to say, what do you want Brexit to look like? Because they're kind of running out of options at the moment. You know, you can go for a permanent customs union, Norwegian style, but even that comes with a whole lot of compromises, which is not what the Brits voted for back in 2016. So it is getting exceptionally complicated in terms of what will happen. A no-deal Brexit will be a disastrous outcome. Let's make no mistake about it. The cost of business will go up. The cost of trade will go up. When the cost of trade goes up, or even the talk of the cost of trade goes up, consumption goes down. That's exactly what we saw happening with Apple in the fourth quarter in China, right? The mere threat of trade talks and a slowing down Chinese economy meant that there was lower consumption, and Apple felt the pinch of that. So I think that this Brexit issue is not going away. The fact that we've seen a solid pound for the last couple of days, I wouldn't read too much much into that. I think we need to find a definitive conclusion to this, and unfortunately, political instability remains littered across the world. We sit on the southern tip of Africa and we watch our own politics and we think, like, you know, the number of own goals we score, it's no better anywhere else in the world. You know, the political instability is littered across the world.
Right. Thank you very much for those insights, Jane. You've heard it there. Political instability is littered across the world. I've been speaking there to Nadir Thokan, who's an investment analyst at 274. It's back to you, Jane.
Thanks, and probably good news for Britain, at least after the Brexit disaster. We've got a short break, and then I'll see you back after the break, and we're going to be going to Baghdad.